Look, I opened this jar of rotten baby food, and well, a butterfly came out.
I don't know about that. I think he became the first censor.
That's right.
Uh,
That's one way to look at it.
yeah, I think he was not kidding when he did that.
Welcome to the Comedians in Elevators podcast. I've got my guest, Robert LaRocca. Robert, say hi, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Keenan. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So a little bit about myself. I'm a writer. Been writing since I was a kid. I was a playwright when I was living in New York. Had some productions off Broadway. And then for a while, then I started getting into film, and I worked as an assistant editor on documentary films while I was still in New York. And then I decided to take the plunge and focus on screenwriting. And now I'm a screenwriter and a humor blogger here in LA. I've got a podcast, not a podcast, I've got a blog on Substack, Ask an Angry American. And that scratches my itch for getting my work out there and writing daily and having it be seen. And my screenwriting is kind of more personal and a little deeper and takes a little longer to get it out to the public, but that's something I'm here in LA to work on. So
Awesome, awesome. Well, Robert, are you ready to get into it?
absolutely.
Listen, to my regular listeners, I know you don't like when at the beginning of these conversations I ask you to subscribe. None of us like it. I don't like saying it. I don't like it being in here. But it's frustrating. You know what else is frustrating? It's also frustrating when I look in the back end of the YouTube channel and I see that 56% of you that watch frequently haven't yet subscribed. And I know this because I see it in the comment section. You say things like, I didn't know I didn't subscribe. And that's actually what fuels the show. Basically, it's like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask all the time, because it enables us to build and build and build. And we're going for the long term here. Hit the subscribe button and we'll continue to build this show for you. That's my promise. Thank you to all you guys that do subscribe. It means the world to me. All right, so the whole point of the podcast is to compare and contrast the comic versus the comedian. So I define the comic as any person telling funny jokes versus the comedian who's a funny person telling any jokes. So Robert, would you agree that you start as a comic and evolve into a comedian?
I think I think that's true of some people. I can think of certain comics, some of my favorite comics like Wanda Sykes and some of my maybe less favorite comics, Dave Chappelle, and just legendary comics like George Carlin and Len Bruce. I think they started as a lot of them started as joke tellers, and then they kind of evolved into storytellers who tell jokes. So it started as comics and then evolved into comedians, I think.
That's how I see it. So what about the role of persona in comedy? How much of the comedian's voice is a character versus their real self?
Yeah, I know for me personally, with my screenwriting, that tends to be more personal. That tends to be more my voice. With the humor blog I write, um, the concept is that it's a really bad advice column written by someone whose advice you shouldn't follow. So in the blog, I'm actually playing a character who is kind of like my evil alter ego. And it's a little tricky because that's my voice has to sneak in there because my voice isn't his voice, the angry American character. But with my screenwriting, yeah, it tends to be more personal. It tends to be um, kind of consistent in terms of tone and genre, and about who I am. Um, in terms of other comedians and stuff, I think of again Wanda Sykes, who's a lot of her stuff is very personal. A lot of it is based on personal stories in her life. Um, uh, and then you've got someone like George Carlin who doesn't tell all that many stories about his life, but his voice really comes through, which is an anti-authoritarian, a very deeply cynical voice. So I think eventually with the comic particularly, I think because it's more raw, their voice comes through. With the comedian, it's kind of like the voice is there, but sometimes it's under the surface and you have to dig it out.
Okay. So does authenticity matter or is illusion part of the magic?
I think there has to be authenticity on some level. Like with my blog, there's a lot of illusion because I'm writing as a character. That's not me. But I think authenticity matters at the end of the day, whether your message is very much on the surface or what you're trying to say is kind of buried beneath layers of artifice. It's got to be real. It's got to be like what you really feel, what you really, it's got to be your true voice in some aspects. So, and I think people recognize it when um, it's not authentic. I have a friend, Lizzie Beck, Boeck. Look for her on TikTok, and her stuff is very much raw and personal, and her authentic voice really comes through. Other
Uh-huh.
people prefer political humor, um, and you get a sense of where they are on the political spectrum. So in that sense, I think authenticity is always important, whether it's personal stories you're telling or if it's more indirect.
Okay. Speaking of politics, punching up versus punching down. So where do comics versus comedians stand on this? So let me put it in some historical context. Did a jealous medieval prince become the first comedian by killing the court jester? Beady, 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 beady.
Mm. I don't know about that. I think he became the first censor.
That's right.
Uh,
That's one way to look at it.
yeah, I think he was not kidding when he did that. In terms of punching up versus punching down, um, comics do both. Dave Chappelle can punch down. Sometimes he can punch up. Um, George Carlin and Lenny Bruce, they tended to punch up. So I think comics in general are flexible, whether they punch up or punch down. And comedians can be too. It just depends on what they decide their target is going to be.
Okay.
Personally, I try to prefer to punch up when I can. I try to catch myself if I'm punching down because people who are more vulnerable have enough to deal with without some guy on Substack taking a shot at them.
You got a point there. So is the audience agreement with the comedian a form of permission or alignment?
I think so. I think if you gravitate toward those comics who you respond to, whose authentic voice you respond to. So, they have different fan bases and their fans are responding to what they're putting out authentically.
Okay. So, cultural translation of comedy. How do jokes that work in one country bomb in another?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question, especially since I'm a screenwriter and the accepted wisdom is that comedy doesn't travel well beyond borders. I think some comedy travels well beyond borders. I think broader comedy, slapstick comedy, visual comedy tends to translate better. Um, but if you're looking at something like political satirists like Andy Borowitz, if he's very culturally specific. And there may be people in other countries who are deeply invested in, what's happening politically. He's a political satirist is going on in America. They may respond to that. But people who aren't as clued in this country or other countries won't. It just won't be their cup of tea. So I think in general, the comic, I'm going to say the comic is more culturally specific because he's got the audience in front of him and he's got to reach them. He's not looking for a global audience. He or she, they and whereas the comedian might be trying to put something out there into the world that is more global and that everyone can relate to in some basic human way.
Okay. So, is truth the meaning of facts?
Truth, excuse me, truth I think is subjective. I think we all have different truths. We can see in this country people on different spectrums politically have very different ideas of what the truth is. Um, I think certain things you can point to factually as being truthful, but there are a lot of people who don't accept what I would accept as the truth. They would question it. So truth is tricky. I think truth, fortunately or unfortunately, is becoming more increasingly subjective.
Okay. So is meaning the meaning of facts?
Mhm. Yeah, again, I'm going to go subjective with that. I think meaning is each individual connects to, what has meaning for them. What
Okay.
has meaning for me would not be the same as what someone in a very different circumstance might see as having meaning.
All right. So crowd work versus crafted work. So if comics riff like influencers in the comments section and comedians perform like in reaction videos, where's the sweet spot?
Mm. It's interesting because I'm aware of comics who do a lot of crowd work and some who just go up there and they've got a script and they're hitting all their points and they're performing to the audience, but the audience isn't, they don't do crowd work at all. Um, I think the sweet spot is um, how much of what you're doing is feeding off the audience and how much of it is coming from something that you basically want to say and you want to get your message out there. Um, so I think that can vary for the comic. I think crowd work for a comic is kind of a high wire act because if you get an audience that's not responsive, then you can only work with what they give you. Um, but the comedian, I think, um, really performs like for themselves what they respond to. And then they find out later after they put it out into the world whether anyone else responds to it at all. So I think the sweet spot for comics is even if you've got a structure and a script, I think you're still kind of feeding off the audience to some respect, whereas the comedian um, is more developed work, and then you find out later whether the audience responds to it or not.
Okay. So what happens when a comic leans too much into the high wire act of crowd work?
Then, well, then they better be able to improvise pretty quickly. I mean, if I remember one time I was in an audience for a comic, and he asked a question. I can't remember what it was. I think he was like in a persona of like a messiah or something like that. And I just did not know how to respond to that, to what he said to me. And I just froze. And the guy had to improvise. I think what he said was like, some are chosen or something like that. And he kind of like had to turn around and then move on to the next person. So I think you have to be pretty nimble if you're a comic with doing crowd work.
All right. So what about when a comedian gets heckled?
I've never actually seen that happen. Maybe because a lot of the times when I'm watching a comic, it's on Netflix or something, and maybe that stuff is edited out, or it's a big audience or something like that. But I think when a comic is heckled, they have to do the same thing. They have to find a way to turn it around and defend themselves and make it funny. So, which is tricky, and it's a test of improvisational skills, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do stand up, and it's in the basically there aren't hecklers anymore. So what happens is the other comedians will become hecklers,
Oh
just
wow.
so that there are, and trust me, another comedian will be very if they're not pulling any punches, they will be so much worse than anyone in the audience could be as a heckler, right? When you're like, what are you doing? You're doing the worst possible thing you could do.
Oh my God.
So, right? Okay,
Oh
so
wow.
very important. Yeah, I know, right? So there it is. There are still hecklers out there. We're going to keep the hecklers alive. So advertising and self-promotion. So who advertises themselves more? The comic, the comedian, or the magician? You know that place where you're not conscious and you're not sleeping either? That's your power bill to the electric company. Right here. I want us to be here, with free energy, where the Wardenclyffe Tower meets the Eiffel Tower. But that's not where we are. We are here, where you've got the utility and you've got residential solar. Between these two, we know which one saves you money. This is where we can go in the meantime. But this is where I want us to be now, and this can be done now. So let me deputize you to represent DOSE, Department of Solar Efficiency, and let's get on the podcast to get the message out today. See you soon.
I think the comic for the comic and the magician, they are their brand. So that's self-promotion at its most self-promoty, I guess. The comedian, I know with my blog and with my scripts, yeah, there's an aspect of where I'm selling myself and my story. But really what people see first is the work. So it's what I'm writing that I'm promoting first. And then if I get my foot in the door, then I have to let potential production partners or reps know who I am and where I'm coming from. So I think with the comic and magician, it's self-promotion is key. And with the comedian, it's important, but what comes first is the work you're putting out.
So is self-promotion seen as selling out, or is it necessary for survival?
Yeah, I think it's very necessary. I think how you do it is important. I think it's good to not just self-promote yourself, but promote others. Something I've been getting into lately, I'm trying to get in more into social media, is when I see something like I love the show Andor, the character-based storytelling, hints of dark humor, and in a familiar universe, but heightened. And I saw an opportunity yesterday to respond to, like, they won an Emmy, Creative Arts Emmy for production design, I think. And I just wrote a response online about how, I thought it was a great show and how it connected with me personally and with my writing. So that's kind of a balancing act of a little bit of self-promotion, but also just being a fan and getting the word out there. And also someone whose book, Carol Kirshner, she wrote a book on getting work in Hollywood, and I found it to be helpful. And I saw an opportunity to respond to a post of hers, and she responded with a thank you. So I think self-promotion going hand in hand with promotion of stuff you have affinity for is takes the sting, takes the selling out aspect out of self-promotion.
All right, I'll agree with you on Andor. I see it. There's a whole other layer of very dark humor that's like a meta. It's very above the rest of the storyline. So if
Yeah,
you're not paying attention or if you're not intelligent enough to follow it, it doesn't exist. But if
right.
you are, it's there and it's quite consistent. All right, so censorship and offense. Does a comic avoid offense while a comedian courts it to prove a point, like a magician?
Well, some comics definitely just dig right into committing offense, and I don't know if that's the goal or if they just don't care and they're just being authentic about who and what they are. And of course, I'm thinking of like Dave Chappelle right now with what he said about trans people. Um, I think that I don't know if a comic courts offense. I don't know if Dave Chappelle courts offense as opposed to just being who he is and saying what he believes. Um, and I think a comedian could also court offense. Like I mentioned Andy Borowitz before, and he has very decided leftish political opinions and is very harsh on Trump and Republicans. So in a sense, he's courting offense, but he's also being authentic. So I think that's the thing. I think whether you're a comic or a comedian, and I know when I started my blog, I was kind of afraid of putting my own voice out there because I was afraid I got some really hostile comments on Facebook, for example, to some of the stuff I was putting out there. But I think in the end, you kind of have to look for your people. So whether it courts offense or not, I think you have to be authentic and you have to have a point of view and you have to express that point of view. And a lot of people won't agree with it. So in that sense, you're courting offense just by existing and being honest.
I'll agree with that. So, who survives better in the cancel culture environment? The comic, the comedian, the magician or the mudslinger?
I think the mudslinger exists and helps empower a cancel culture because he's just attacking those, or he or she or they're attacking those people who they disagree with, and with the object of bringing them down, getting them canceled. Um, I think in terms of who of the others survives best in a cancel culture, I think the magician, because they can kind of avoid um, tricky points of view. I think they're more pure entertainment and a sense of wonder and more universal feeling of like, I'm going to show you this trick and you're gonna love it, hopefully. The comic can get in trouble just from a single joke. We've seen that with people getting fired from SNL because of past posts or past jokes they've told, excuse me, they've told. And I think the comedian, because there's a layer of artifice in what they do, survives a little bit better in cancel culture. But I mean, if they're being authentic, they could say all sorts of things that would offend people and get canceled too.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Oh, very good. So, timing and delivery, would you say science or art? So, do comics rely more on structure and comedians more on rhythm and emotion?
Hmm. I think timing is partly a science, it's partly a skill you can learn, but it's also an art. You have to start with some talent. You have to be able to read the room, in other words. I think comics have to rely more on, they can come in with a set and it's structured. Um, but they also have to make adjustments as they go along, depending on the reaction from the crowd. So, and timing is part of that. So I think it's much more of it starts out as a science for the comic, but it becomes an art in performance because you really have to be present and get a sense of what's going on. With the comedians, I think since we tend to get our feedback after the fact, after we put our work out there, um, we rely more on structure and science. And I think the timing comes in later in the process as we're fine tuning what we're putting out there and seeing what works for us really, because we can show this the script or the blog to other people and get their feedback, but really a lot of it, our first audience is ourselves. So we have to just get a feel for what the timing is, what the structure is, and what works for us. So in that sense, I think for comedians, it's more of a science.
Okay. So, laughter versus applause. So, are comics chasing laughs while comedians are chasing applause breaks or a primetime Emmy that validate the message?
Um, I think comics much more are definitely chasing laughter. Um, you know, they want each joke to hit. Um, Whereas comedians, I think you have a little bit more leeway. I think if you're saying something that's interesting, it doesn't have to be a joke a minute. So I would say comedians are more chasing applause, although they do want their stuff to be funny. They do want to get laughs, but I think comedians are more chasing applause, whereas comics are kind of as a survival mechanism, chasing laughter and then hoping that if they get enough laughs, that leads to applause at the end.
All right. So, comedy is commentary. So, when does a comedian cross into being a philosopher or a preacher?
Yeah, that's something I have to watch out for in my blog because I have definitely the hardest part of writing the blog is coming up with something to write about, and usually it's something that's like bugging me that day. And what do I want to say about it? And then how do I want to say about what? How do I say it? Given the fact that I'm writing a quote unquote bad advice column where the person who's giving the advice is not to be trusted. I don't want people actually following the bad advice. So I try to make sure that it's clear what my real message is. But I don't want to hit people over the head on it with it either, because then that's not fun. Um, so I think, if you hit the message too hard as a comedian, then that's when you become a preacher or philosopher, and you've probably gone too far. I think you want to give people an idea of where you're coming from, but you don't want to preach or philosophize about it.
So you're the second guest I've had that's mentioned the bad advice column,
Uh,
and that they're working on that. So what genre would that be?
I'd say satire. A lot of my screenwriting also has a satirical edge to it, and dark comedy. So this is kind of a twisted character. He's the angry American is this like independently wealthy guy who chooses to live in a cabin in the woods away from everybody else. So he's probably the last person in the world who should be giving advice, but he thinks he's doing great because he has no feedback from the outside world. So he thinks he's empowered to give advice. Um, so I think satire primarily.
I like your character. So again, like I said, your second to guest that's mentioned this character. Um, what archetype would this character be? If this is it makes sense as a question, do you have an idea, or does it make sense?
Yeah, I think he'd be the trickster. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, I think he's the guy who sounds very certain about what he's talking about and who you should not trust at all, because he'll lead
Okay.
you down a bad path.
Very good. I like it. You fit right into the format that I use. Awesome. Okay, so are you ready to enter into the multiverse?
Okay.
So now the elevator doors are opening on the fourth dimension and the infinite plane of time and space. So, board game Zoomcast, play versus performance. If comedy were a board game Zoomcast, are you competing as the colorist, adding tone, mood, and shading, or the Foley artist, building punchlines with soundscapes and timing?
I think the Foley artist, that when you asked the question, that was just what I immediately responded to more. Um, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, does comedy work better when it's painted vividly or when it's orchestrated sonically?
Mm. I think I think you want both tools, set of tools in your toolbox, but I think it probably works best when it's vivid. Um, you don't want to be too subtle. Sometimes you'd like to be subtle. Sometimes you need to be subtle in terms of like, not wanting to hammer home a message too hard. But yeah, I think when the jokes are clear and stand out, that's when you're in your sweet spot.
So just to touch on that, so would you say that perhaps it would be appropriate to set the stage by painting a joke vividly with the setup, and then the punchline is the sonic, the soundscape?
Mm. Yeah, I think so. I think that sounds right. Yeah, you want to basically set it up, whether it's a joke in a script or it's a column where you kind of have to establish the ground rules. Um, yeah, you definitely need to set it up and then, punch home the joke.
All right. So we've got a tradition here on the Comedians and Elevators podcast where the previous guest asks a question for the next guest. And so the previous guest, Robert, was Dr. Diddy. And her question is, if humor is holy, do you agree?
Mm. Yeah, I think it can be. I think it can be. I think, you know, God knows we all need a laugh. And I think when there's not just a laugh, but there's like some truth behind it, that can be holy.
Okay. So last question, legacy. Who gets remembered? Will the comics tight five survive time, or will the comedian's cultural point of view be more timeless?
Hmm. Well, I still see George Carlin popping up on my TikTok. So I think in that sense, his tight fives have survived time. Um, I think there are a few comics who have that survivability, that longevity. I think comics tend to be of the moment, so it's harder. And I think you have to be more universal to have that kind of longevity as a comic. I think it's easier to be more timeless if you're a comedian. I mean, we're still reading Mark Twain, more than 100 years after he wrote. So I think the comedian has the advantage because the comic is like joke, 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 and the comedian tells a story. So there's not the same high wire act that the comic does of having, every joke needing to be hit or having to hit or then moving on to the next one. I think the comedian's got a little bit more leeway because there are other factors in there that to keep people entertained. There are characters, there's story. And that makes it easier for the comedian to have a better chance at being timeless. Not that comics can't be timeless, but I think comedians have the advantage there.
Have you seen AI George Carlin on TikTok?
No, I heard about it, and I heard that they got sued and they took it down, I think.
Oh, that's why I haven't seen it lately. Well, it's very good because the George Carlin has a very specific format, and
Mhm.
AI is good at formats. So
Oh,
it was really in his style. So, all right. So, Robert, where can everybody find you online?
best place to find me online is through my Substack, Ask an Angry American. If you search for me there, you'll see not only my blogs, but you'll also see all my social media connections.
All right, very cool. Well, Robert, thank you so much for being my guest. And for everyone, please like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.